Okay, U.S. history. This is your lecture for Thursday, February 11th. We have a little bit of review to do. We're going to do a little preview of your document of the week, and then we're going to jump into the notes about the bombing of Pearl Harbor and talk a little bit about cryptography as well. On Friday, we won't have too many notes, just maybe 10 minutes of notes on Friday. And then we're going to do our normal Friday review activities and draw a document of the week pass and all of those good things. So let's jump right into this worksheet. So it's very early. I'm recording this Wednesday morning, so I don't have that many results back in yet, but I suspect this should go pretty well, especially if you took good notes. So if you don't have this in yet, I'm afraid that you have to take the 0 on this one, but let's go over the material so we make sure we get it right on the test. So the first question, Sam thinks getting involved in World War II is a bad idea. This is very clearly an isolationist. Oh, it's not going to let me click that. Hold on. Let me see if it'll let me do it this way. There we go. That is very clearly an isolationist. Fred hates how the Nazis are treating weaker nations. He thinks we should get directly involved. Well, that's obviously an interventionist. And then which policy led to the armed forces swelling over 1 million people? And it gets way higher than that when the actual war hits. But that's the draft. And the fancy word for the draft is, or phrase for the draft is selective service and training. Which policy made the U.S. look neutral, but really helped the British out more because they had the strongest navy in the world? Well, cash and carry. It was all about the idea of, oh, anybody could come here and buy this stuff, but really the British were the only ones really taking advantage of it. Which policy led us to gaining more naval bases in the Pacific? Well, if you remember, the British needed more supplies, but in particular destroyers, and so we made the destroyer deal, where we ended up gaining 8 naval bases for 99 years, and they in exchange got destroyers. What U.S. strategy policy was based mostly on the ideas of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points? That is absolutely the Atlantic Charter. A very important thing to know. It is, in many ways, just a rebranding of Wilson's 14 points. Which nation did we end up giving those 50 old World War I destroyers to? That's absolutely Great Britain. Which nation's submarines and navy did we have multiple conflicts with once we decided to escort the supplies to the Allies? Well, that's going to be the German Navy. And then, how much in supplies did we did we let the Allies borrow under Lend-Lease? We ended up giving away $50 billion worth of supplies. $50 billion worth of supplies. I was making up fake numbers, and that's the number from an old 80s song. That's why I thought that was funny. I'm a nerd. We know that. Most people thought that guys like Sam described in question 1 would eventually change their minds as Germany continued to shock the world. However, it was the action of one of Germany's allies, another Axis power, Japan, that changed so many people's minds. What event, more than anything else, convinced most Americans that a war with the Axis powers was inevitable? It is absolutely the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And that's what we're going to get into today. So easy enough. But I hope I did well. Before we do that, I want to give you a preview of your document of the week that is going to be due for next Wednesday. And you should have time to work on it in class today. And honestly, you'd be smart to just get it out of the way because you're thinking the material you need to do this, we've already done. This is all about a guy who's an isolationist, a famous guy. So your document is one I'm giving to you. So that means you're going to give your summary and you're going to give your opinion. And your challenge is whether or not this is a primary or secondary document. Remember, you think it's a primary document if you think these are his actual words. You think this is a secondary document if you think this is a historian talking about his words. So, Charles Lindbergh, September 11th, ironically, 1941. So Pearl Harbor is going to get bombed December 7th, 1941. So this is a couple months before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And he is going to talk about all the reasons we should not get in the war. He thinks that this is a really, really bad idea. Now, Charles Lindbergh, who's this guy? If you remember, we talked about him in the 20s. He's the first to fly solo across the Atlantic in an airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. So he's a very famous person, and he's like, hey, we shouldn't be doing this. And listen, he was like most Americans at the time. You know, a little bit over 90% of Americans were isolationists, again, until one major event, and that's the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So you already know what you need to know as far as you understand what isolationists and interventionists are. So you could do this document right now, get it out of the way. It's not that hard to read, and you have to show you read it. You have to talk about some of the points that he makes about why he believes we should be isolationists, and then you give your opinion, whether you think we should have been or shouldn't have been. All right, let's jump into the notes. So, let's talk about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Japan is one of the three Axis powers. So there's actually several, but the big powers within the Axis would be Germany, then Italy, and then Japan. And Japan is becoming more and more of a problem. And we have this problem that, in some ways, to a greater degree, Germany had in World War I, is that if we get involved in this war, we've got enemies on both sides, on both fronts. The saving grace for us, though, is we have oceans in between, whereas Germany in World War I, they're fighting a two-front war, and troops are on the ground on both sides. We have the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean to shelter us to some degree. But we did not, we were not excited to find out that the Japanese had joined Germany and Italy and were part of this Axis power. And what we did as Japan started to expand, and essentially Japan felt that they had a right to control the Pacific. That was always their intent, even when they attacked Pearl Harbor. It's not really about trying to take over the United States. It's about trying to take over and assert complete power over the Pacific. If you want to have a comparison, the United States has proclaimed, for over 200 years, that the Monroe Doctrine, that this is our hemisphere, North and South America, don't mess with it. The Japanese were essentially saying, don't mess with the Pacific, and they viewed the United States as a threat to this controlling of the Pacific. Now, we had long relations and trade with China. You can go all the way back in our notes to the open door policy in China. And Japan had started in 1937 a series of attacks against China, and they are doing awful things to Chinese civilians. Now, listen, militarily, they are winning battle after battle after battle. The Japanese military is much stronger than the Chinese military, but the Chinese do have mass numbers, and so the Japanese are not moving through as quickly. And China's pretty big geographically, too. They're not moving through as quickly as they'd like, so they are trying to break down the will of their people. And they believe, the Japanese at this time, that they are superior to the Chinese. So yes, they have these correlations with the other Axis powers, where of course, Germany thinks that the Aryan race is better and all that crazy stuff. So the Japanese are doing things like, and this is horrific, they were going into civilian areas, and even hospitals, and throwing Chinese babies out windows and catching them on the knives on the end of their guns called bayonets. They were doing these grotesque things. There's this event called the Rape of Nanking, which is just the murdering of a couple 100,000 Chinese civilians. Just horrible stuff. So we said, okay, we cannot trade with you anymore. Even though under cash and carry they were coming to the United States to buy critically needed items, we said, that's it, we're done. This is too repulsive what you're doing. So now we essentially do say, if you stop doing these awful things, the Chinese will trade with you again. But we can't trade with you under these circumstances. So this left Japan with two choices. Of course, they could do what we want them to do. They could withdraw from China, and then we would continue to trade with them. The biggest thing they were getting from us, by the way, was fuel. Now, they were getting scrap iron and some other things, but fuel, the United States at the time was by far producing more oil than anybody else. Even immediately after the war, we were producing twice as much as all the other nations combined. The Middle East, where we think of, sort of the hot spot of oil today, that occurs later. We don't know about those great resources until a little bit later. So Japan really needs us for fuel. Their whole power is in their navy, and that navy needs fuel. And they have another option in mind. They could just declare the war on the United States and take supplies from various Pacific territories that they might need. I still don't, a lot of historians still say it's still going to leave you short on fuel, but they thought maybe the Germans were going to be able to help them out with that one. So we know that the Japanese are going to choose to attack. At the time, the Japanese were doing a pretty good job of convincing American diplomats that they were really close to leaving China. And so we were not really, listen, we certainly knew it was a possibility we were going to go to war. And we're going to talk about some code breaking that let us have a really good idea, but we just never dreamed the battle was going to take place in Pearl Harbor. We had pretty closely broken the Japanese code, which for whatever reason, and I honestly don't know, we called purple. And we knew the attack was coming soon. So I'm going to take a moment from the notes here just to show you a little bit about codes. Any of you who love math, maybe you could be code breakers someday. Some of this stuff just hurts my head to think about. But we're going to do, I'll show you a few real simple looks at codes, and then I'm going to show you a PowerPoint at the end of the notes today that goes a little bit more in depth. But you know, there's real simple codes. You could have like keyword codes. So you basically have, imagine a little card that gets given to you, and it's probably in a seal, and you break that seal, and you pull out this card, and you go, oh, today's keywords are, really? This isn't going to work? Okay, there we go. Today's keywords are history and maple. So those are two keywords, and with those keywords, you have these numbers, and you go, okay, 8M, and then 6R, and then 10, oh, Mr. P is cool, and that's what you get. Sure, that's what we'll go with. Now, that's a very simple keyword code. What you have to understand about maple is purple, is that they added another several dozens of layers to it. So for example, you take these numbers for these keywords, but you have a machine, like very famously the Germans had this machine called Enigma. And what it would do is it would automatically take the numbers through a mathematical process. So instead of just having nice simple numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you might get 2.653 and then 6.173 and all these other numbers, and then you have to figure it out. That's what hurts your head. Code breakers figuring this one out isn't too hard to guess. If I gave you half an hour, even less for many of you, you could figure it out, especially if we had a lot of messages, you could figure out this code. But when you start doing this, and you go, well, what are you doing with this? Well, for this example, I took each number from the code above, but I multiplied it by 96, and then I added 7, then I divided by 3. So to solve, you have to multiply by 3, subtract by 7, and divide by 0.96. Then you get the numbers. Then you have to figure out what the letters stand for. And you go, that hurts my head just to think about. You know, the Mr. Dvorskys, the Mrs. Franklins of the world, they'd be able to figure this out. But purple had over 100 permutations of their code. So 100 mathematical events occurred for every single letter. And somehow we broke it, which is just mind-numbing. Mind-numbing. So when we break it, we knew an attack was near. But either we didn't have enough of the code broken to understand exactly where, or they were smart enough to not say, hey, remember, we're attacking Pearl Harbor tomorrow. We just knew the attack was coming soon. We suspected the Philippines. The Philippines made more sense to us. It's much closer to Japan. I mean, Pearl Harbor is, first off, understand this, Hawaii was not a state yet. Okay, this is 1941. Hawaii doesn't become a state until later. In addition, this is thousands of miles from the coast of Japan. We had no idea they would ever do this, but it's logical to do this because this is where the heart of our power was at for us being a naval power. And we had started to become a naval power at the end of the Spanish-American War when we took territories like the Philippines and we annexed Hawaii. So this attack on Pearl Harbor just completely shocked us. It's so far away, but it does strategically make sense because it was the heart of all of our holdings in the Pacific. So on this early morning attack, I believe at 7:55 a.m., you end up having 8 battleships lost, about 250 airplanes lost, a little over 2,500 men killed. Luckily, our 3 aircraft carriers that were based in Pearl were out to sea. Now, this was a horrific loss as it was. But these, like a battleship, we were getting to the point where we can make a battleship in really close to 8 or 9 months, which is insanely fast. An aircraft carrier, plus all the airplanes it carries, those can take about a year and a half to make. And those end up becoming critically strategically important during the war. Aircraft carriers become sort of the heart of naval power, really moving forward from World War II on. There are a lot of people that would suggest to you, and I can't say if they're right or wrong, that if our aircraft carriers had been at Pearl and they had been sunk, we might have just given up on the Pacific. Now again, the Japanese had no intent to attack us. They didn't have enough people. We're too vast of a land. They're not going to invade the United States. But they had hoped that they would have such a devastating effect on our Pacific fleet that we would just go, well, I guess we're not going to be a power in the Pacific anymore, and we'll just worry about the Germans. We'll just worry about fighting in Europe. They really had hoped that would happen. And had they knocked out those 3 aircraft carriers, there are some people who say we couldn't have. We could not have held them off. We just would have said, oh well, we're not a Pacific power anyway, which a lot of people who were isolationists in the 20s and 30s, especially the 30s, said, listen, we didn't really want to be in the Pacific anyway. We were withdrawing more and more troops from the Pacific all the time. It's not like we were at the end of the Spanish-American War. But the Japanese had been planning this for a really long time. Starting in 1898 and appearing every other year, apparently a final exam question appeared on the naval an officer's test that said, how would you conduct an attack on Pearl Harbor? I mean, they knew for a long time, if they were ever going to remove us from the Pacific, this is the way you did it. So again, I don't want you to think that the attack on Pearl Harbor was going to be, a prelude to them invading the United States. We're geographically too big, and we had way more people than they did, but it is plausible. I mean, it almost worked. The idea that could have made it so that we just gave up on being a Pacific power anymore. Now, some of the pictures from the attack, and I'm going to link a quick 6-minute video of footage that came out a couple weeks after. But I mean, this was pretty devastating. Our battleships, for example, were in Battleship Row. They were all docked right next to each other. If we had known an attack was coming in any way, shape, or form, we would have at least scattered those ships, because when you have them all docked next to each other, you could be aiming for ship 2, miss badly, and still hit ship 4. You have to, spread out those targets. It's something you do as individuals on a battlefield, and what you do with resources like battleships. But of the 2,500 men that were killed, the overwhelming majority were on the USS Arizona, which absolutely got devastated by a torpedo. You hear 2 stories, one down basically a vent, a tube, one that lands in the engine room and blows up the fuel. Another, some historians say no, it probably went into a compartment that held all the other bombs, and when that bomb went off, either way, the Arizona is just completely devastated almost instantly and flips over. And as it flips over, it traps right around 1,200 men. So about half the fatalities of Pearl Harbor are from this one battleship. And this battleship still lies on the bottom of Pearl Harbor today. They cut off what would be the Conning Tower, and they just put a memorial right over it. So there are hundreds of men entombed in there. And you can take out a boat to the middle of this in Pearl Harbor. This what's supposed to be a very moving museum that it shows, pictures of the day and pictures of the men that were lost right out in the middle of this harbor. So let's see. So that's what it looks like overhead. Let me flip back a page. And this is what it would look like from shore. You are here on shore, and that white thing that I showed you is out there in the middle of the harbor where the Arizona sank. Well, where it was moved a little bit too. So those are all of your notes on that particular section. We're all set. Now I do want to show you something on cryptography real quick, and then we'll get you going on your document of the week. So some of you might care about this. I normally would play a podcast with this, but for the recording, I can't, copyright issues, I can't play something else like that. But no secret here, I listen to a lot of history podcasts, including Stuff You Missed in History, least shocking thing you've ever heard. And they do a great podcast, which is, I designed this PowerPoint to go along with it. You don't have to hear the podcast now, but I want to show you some of the things they talk about. That cryptography ends up becoming a huge part of World War II. And it's just it's a Greek word, I believe, and it has its origins in that, and it just means hidden writing. And there's all types of different codes. And there's the monoalphabetic cipher. And so that's where you just make up a code sheet and you go, okay, this letter is going to equal this, and this letter is going to equal this. Maybe you move all the letters a little, 3 down the line or something like that. And it's pretty easy to break. So, okay, this one says I love history. It's pretty simple to break. If you work with it a little bit, you can figure it out. And you go, well, how could you figure it out? Well, if you know anything about breaking a code, you study the language enough to know that, okay, in the English language, there are just certain letters that are more likely to appear. So what you're going to see is E, T, A. So if you can figure out some of those letters, you can start piecing things together. You also know that certain letters are more likely to appear back to back, double letters, T, T, L, L. And then also, if your code's bad enough and you just have it in the literal breaks of the words, you can really figure it out quickly. Now, if you're smarter, you'll do it in 5-letter blocks, even if that happens to contain one big word here and then there's an A or an I in the middle of this. There's ways to make it tougher, but listen, you can figure it out. If that was your job, you could figure it out. So then you have the polyalphabetic cipher. This is where you get real fancy, and some of this might be cut off in the recording. I see the little red line. You can't quite see up above it, but you get the idea. A letter, the first time it would appear would be one letter, but then the second time it goes to another letter, and then the third time it appears, it becomes another letter yet again. That's a little bit tougher to break, but you could still do it. It's not by any stretch impossible. It just takes a little bit more work. Now, polygraphic ciphers, those are tougher. This is where you're not necessarily using letters. You could be using symbols mixed with letters. So this one's tougher, but again, you can figure it out. A more advanced version of that might be a transpositional cipher. And this is where you just have a big jumble of letters or symbols, and you change all the time through this number that you're going to send. And again, that number, and this is how the Japanese code purple was, it's a transpositional cipher, plus it's a number, plus that number has gone through over 100 permutations. But what you are saying is, first I want you to go to the 27th letter, then fifth I want you to go to the 8th letter, then I want you to go to the 69th letter, then the 49th letter, and you can spell out, the next message. And of course, this would be pages and pages of letters. And instead of it being the 5th letter and the 8th letter, it might be the 850th letter or something like that. But still breakable. So what we really want to do, if you really want to have an unbreakable code, well, and really, nobody had an unbreakable code. We broke the German code because we found an Enigma machine, and we then basically tore it apart and reverse engineered it. With Japanese, we just did it through math guys being completely nerded out and locked into a room until they figured out the calculations. The only code from World War II of significance that was never broken was the United States code. And that's because we did something incredibly clever. We did all of these mathematical things that everybody else did. However, we broke it down, or we originally created it and based it on a code book based on another language, not English. You see, in the United States, we don't have a lot of Japanese speakers, but we do have Japanese speakers, and they're going to be critical to breaking apart purple. In the United States, we had lots of people that spoke German. They're critical to helping breaking down Enigma. And obviously in those countries, they had people that spoke English, and they were critical in attempting to break down our code. But we didn't base our code on English. We decided to go with a Navajo language. We knew very few people in the world knew how to read or speak Navajo. Navajo only exists within the boundaries of the United States. And we then drafted young Navajo men to be what we call code talkers. And they were essentially giving us the basis of these messages. And then we sequestered the thousands of people who could speak this language in the United States, basically closed them off to the rest of the world so that nobody could get to them. So now you could break apart the math. And who knows, the Japanese or the Germans may have broken apart the math, but now they're getting letters that don't make any sense because they're spelling out things in Navajo. And even in Navajo, they're not actually the specific message we're trying to say. It's a code. So they're talking about general code books. You have Hawk. You can translate it to Hawk, but what does Hawk mean? It means B-52 bomber. But for the Navajo code, you'd break apart the Navajo word. So Shedagahi down here, that's the Navajo word. First off, if the Japanese translate that, oh my gosh, they're going to be like Shedagahi. That doesn't mean anything. You're looking at the Japanese guy who speaks English, and he's like, I've never heard of that in my life. If you spoke Navajo, you would know that Shedagahi is the word for tortoise or turtle, and of course turtle was just the code word for tank. No wonder this was never broken. I love that big dummy, whatever the Navajo word for big dummy was what we called Hitler. That's just fantastic. Now, just that's World War II. That's why our code was never broken. We're going to talk about the contributions of the Navajo and the code talkers when we get to that section of notes. But I just wanted to show you that where codes are going today. From the 80s on, you saw a lot of stenography, and that is hiding symbols in images. And if you were to zoom in on the rings of these weird clocks, what you would see is that these are B-52 bombers, that you can embed these images into these larger images. And today, the sort of cutting edge of this is that we know that terrorist groups use things like Facebook. And what they're doing is they are taking, and megapixels make it happen. The more megapixels you have, the more data you can fit in. And like if you have an iPhone 11 or iPhone 12, I forget how many megapixels it is, but it's a really good camera, which means it can hold tons of data. That's why a picture looks so good. It has so much detail and crispness in it. Well, it also means that what you can do is take a picture of this guy wearing glasses, but if you zoom in on the frame of the glasses, they have this numeric code. So just like we talked about that numeric code before, now they're hiding it in pictures that look mundane. So you could be a part of a terrorist group and you are just posting a picture of a guy and it doesn't look like anything to anybody looking over these pages, but if you zoom in on the exact right part, you're going to see that there's a coded message. And then something that just completely hurts my head, there's something called pixel scramblers. So you can take a high digital image, a really good, strong, high pixel image, like 15 megapixels of a tree, and you can have a coded program that will break this tree down and rearrange the pixels according to this program in a different order to a lower resolution. So this has been run through a coded program, so you think you see a picture of a tree, but really it's become a coded picture of a cat. And obviously that's useless. It's just trying to show you the power of that. So you could have a coded picture of something innocuous, but it could be a terrorist target. Thank goodness the people that watch out for us are smarter than me, because I just can't wrap my head around how you would figure that out, but they do. Okay, so we've run about 30 minutes. You've got all the notes that you need. You want to make sure those are going to be a big part of the test, obviously. And then tomorrow we're just going to start a little bit of section 4. You've got about 20 minutes now, and you could just get your document of the week done. It is not that tough to do. Just go ahead and do your summary, your opinion, and your challenge. Is this primary or secondary, and why? And just be done with it. Don't take a bad grade on something this simple. All right? Do not have your name left by the sub. That goes very poorly. It's going to be an automatic detention if she does. So, or he. I think it'll be Miss Vargo, but it could be somebody else. So, and you could commiserate with Miss Vargo. She was in my class, so you can tell her all the evil things I do, and she'll go, yeah, I remember. All right? Everybody have a good day, and I should see you Friday.